If my parents had known what I'd loaded onto the living room TV that night, they never would have done what they did. The Wesley family home looked like something ripped from a catalog, polished hardwood floors catching the light, framed diplomas marching down the hallway like soldiers, a chandelier throwing warmth over a dining table crowded with relatives and neighbors who hadn't stopped smiling since they walked through the door. My mother, Adeline, moved through the crowd in a burgundy dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, accepting compliments with practiced grace. My father, Christopher, stood near the fireplace in his custom suit, nodding along as Uncle Jim praised them for being the kind of people who still understand what family means. The whole scene was designed to look generous, selfless, even. I sat at the far end of the table with my fingers wrapped around a glass of water that had gone warm an hour ago, watching my grandfather and trying not to let my face give anything away. My name is Aiden Wesley. I'm 26 years old, a software engineer who spends most days staring at lines of code until they blur together. I'm not the kind of person who usually stands up in crowded rooms and demands attention. But tonight, everything I'd been taught about staying quiet and polite was about to go straight out the window, because the man sitting 3 chairs down from me, the one who looked smaller and more fragile than he had any right to be, deserved better than silence. Ian Wesley, my grandfather, the man who raised me more than the 2 people hosting this dinner ever did. He looked different in my parents' house than he ever had in his own. His shoulders curved forward in a way they never used to, his hands resting on the table with a tremor he didn't have 6 months ago. In front of him sat that chipped navy blue mug he'd carried from his old house, the one he refused to replace even though Adeline kept offering him nicer options. Steam rose from the coffee in thin, shaking lines. Adeline's eyes kept flicking toward that mug, then toward me, then back to the mug. She had no idea what I'd figured out, what I'd seen, what I'd been doing for the last 3 weeks while pretending everything was normal. The guests kept talking, voices layering over each other in that warm buzz that happens when people feel comfortable and well-fed. Aunt Rachel was telling someone about the last time she'd seen Ian, back when he still lived in his own house. He was so independent then, she said, shaking her head with theatrical sadness. But we all slow down eventually, don't we? Christopher jumped in smoothly, his voice carrying that rehearsed sincerity he used with difficult clients. We just couldn't stand the thought of Dad being out there alone, especially after the fall. When you love someone, you do what's necessary. The fall. They'd been mentioning that fall for months now, like it was proof of Ian's fragility. He'd slipped on his back steps during an ice storm and landed hard on his hip. Bruised, but fine. Any other 68-year-old man would have shaken it off and gone back inside. But my parents had turned it into evidence of declining competence. Adeline placed her hand on Ian's shoulder, the gesture tender enough to make several guests smile. "We're just grateful we could give him a safe place," she said. "Somewhere he doesn't have to worry about anything." Ian looked up at her with eyes that seemed fogged over, distant. He managed a small smile that barely registered on his face. "You've been very attentive," he said quietly. Something about the way he said it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. But no one else seemed to notice. Mrs. Chen from 3 houses down raised her wine glass. "We should toast," she announced, "to Christopher and Adeline, for showing us what real family values look like." The guests murmured agreement, reaching for their glasses. Christopher straightened, clearly ready to accept the spotlight. He cleared his throat, and the room settled into anticipatory quiet. That's when I stood up. Every head turned toward me. Adeline's expression flickered just for a second with something that might have been panic before smoothing back into polite curiosity. "Before the toast," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I put together a video, a tribute to my parents and everything they've done for Grandpa Ian since he moved in. I pulled out my phone. I think everyone should see exactly what's been happening in this house." Christopher smiled. "Aiden? That's thoughtful. But maybe after, it'll just take a few minutes." I pressed play. "But before I move forward with that night, you need to understand what led up to that moment. You need to understand how I actually grew up. Not in this polished house with its hardwood floors and framed certificates. Not the place where every conversation felt like a performance review. I'm talking about a crooked little house at the end of Maple Ridge Road, where the asphalt cracked into spider webs and the mailbox leaned at an angle my grandfather never bothered to fix, because it still does its job, doesn't it? That house sat on a narrow lot that backed up to woods my grandfather refused to clear. The paint peeled on the north side where the wind hit hardest. The front porch sagged just enough that a marble would roll from one end to the other. Inside, nothing matched. The kitchen table was scarred with decades of knife marks and coffee rings. The couch had a permanent dip in the middle, where 3 generations of Wesleys had sat and told stories. The heater rattled like it was trying to shake itself apart every winter. It was the most alive place I'd ever known. Ian Wesley built most of that house himself, one addition at a time, whenever he had the money and the energy. He'd spent 40 years working as a mechanic and then a shop foreman at Davidson's Auto, coming home with grease so deep into the lines of his hands that no amount of scrubbing could get it all out. He wore it like a badge. "Honest work leaves marks," he'd say, holding up his oil-stained fingers. "The kind you're proud to show people." He wasn't fancy. Didn't care about impressing anyone. What he cared about was whether you kept your word and whether you could look him in the eye when you spoke. Every other weekend when I was a kid, his beat-up pickup truck would rumble into my parents' driveway on Saturday morning, and I'd already be waiting on the front steps with my backpack. My mother would come to the door in her bathrobe, lipstick already perfect, and remind me to use proper table manners and remember to say thank you. My father wouldn't even come downstairs. Then I'd climb into that truck that smelled like motor oil and coffee, and 15 minutes later, we'd pull up to that crooked house, and I could finally breathe. Ian taught me things no classroom ever bothered with. How to change a tire on a freezing January morning when your fingers go numb and the lug nuts fight you every turn. How to tell when an engine was lying to you when the sound it made didn't match what the problem actually was. How to read people the same way. Listening for what they weren't saying. Watching where their eyes went when they got uncomfortable. Most folks think communication is about talking, he told me once while we were rebuilding a carburetor on his workbench. But the real information is in the gaps. Pay attention to those, kiddo, and you'll know more than people want you to. Saturday mornings meant pancakes on his old cast-iron skillet, the kind that came out uneven and too thick but tasted better than anything my mother's kitchen staff ever made. We'd eat on that scarred table while he told me stories about cars he'd fixed, people he'd known, lessons he'd learned the hard way. Sunday afternoons meant the porch. We'd sit on the steps or the rickety chairs he'd welded together from scrap metal, and we'd just exist. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we didn't. Sometimes he'd point out a bird I'd never noticed before or explain why the sky looked different before a storm. My grandmother Eloise was the warmth that filled every corner of that mismatched house. She moved slower than Ian, her hands twisted with arthritis, but she never stopped moving. She'd hum while she cooked, leave notes on the fridge reminding Ian to take his vitamins, and slip me an extra $10 when I left on Sunday nights with a whisper of, "Don't tell your grandfather." When she laughed, the whole house felt lighter. Together, they'd built something that had nothing to do with money or status or impressing the neighbors. They'd built a home where people mattered more than things, where mistakes were expected and forgiven, where you could show up exactly as you were and nobody asked you to be different. That house taught me what love actually looked like, and watching it disappear, watching Ian disappear, was what turned me from a quiet software engineer into someone willing to destroy his own parents in front of a room full of witnesses. If you're still here, and you are enjoying this story, click subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The problem with having two worlds is that eventually you start to see how little they understand each other. If Ian's house was built on worn wood and decades of stories, the Wesley family home was built on appearances. Every surface had a purpose. Every room had a function. Every object was chosen because it sent the right message to whoever walked through the door. My father, Christopher Wesley, wore suits even on Sundays when we had nowhere to go. He'd sit at the breakfast table in a pressed shirt and tie, scrolling through stock reports on his tablet while his coffee went cold in a bone china cup. He worked as a financial consultant, the kind of person other wealthy people called when they'd made a mess of their money and needed someone to quietly fix it before anyone noticed. Everything in his life was a calculation. Risk versus return. Free for, without slash. Investment versus waste. Reputation versus reality. He talked about optimizing outcomes and strategic positioning, the way other people talked about the weather. Emotions were inefficiencies. Sentiment was a liability. Even his own father was something to be managed, not loved. My mother, Adeline, was sharper than my father in ways that made her more dangerous. She'd trained as a psychologist before moving into corporate consulting, helping executives maximize human capital, which meant teaching them how to squeeze more productivity out of people without those people realizing they were being squeezed. She was beautiful in a way that felt weaponized, every outfit chosen for impact, every smile calculated for effect. At home, she ran our lives like a military operation. My school schedule was color-coded. My extracurricular activities were selected based on college application strategy. Every grade I brought home was analyzed not for what I'd learned, but for what it said about my trajectory. Nothing was ever just for the sake of doing it. Everything had to serve a larger goal. The strange thing was that these two polished, successful people are nothing like Ian. Just family in name. When the three of them were in a room together, it felt like watching people speak different languages while pretending to understand each other. When I was younger, maybe 7 or 8, I didn't notice the tension. I just knew that Friday nights meant sitting at our long dining table under that chandelier, eating carefully arranged meals, while my mother quizzed me on vocabulary words and my father checked his phone between bites. Then Saturday morning, Ian's truck would pull up, and I'd escape to a world where nobody cared if I got dirt on my shirt or said a word wrong. But as I got older, I started noticing things. Like how my father will react badly whenever Ian mentioned fixing something instead of replacing it. Or how my mother's smile would go rigid when Ian showed up in work boots and a flannel shirt that had been patched too many times to count. Or how neither of them ever stayed long when they dropped me off at his house, like being there too long might contaminate them somehow. The argument started when I was around 10. I'd be sleeping on Ian's fold-out couch, drifting off to the sound of crickets and the distant hum of the highway, when voices would filter in from the front porch, low and tense, the kind of angry that tries to stay quiet but can't quite manage it. "You're sitting on property that's worth 10 times what you paid, Dad." That was Christopher's voice, tight with frustration. "The market's only going up. You could sell, buy something smaller, and still have money left over." "It's not about money." Ian's voice, steady and unmovable. "This is my home. Home is just a concept." Adeline's voice would slide in, smooth and reasonable. "What matters is security, comfort, access to medical care. Think about what happens if you fall again. If something goes wrong and no one's around to help. Security isn't a building with nurses checking on me every hour." Ian again, harder now. "Security is knowing the person holding the key to your door actually gives a damn about you." Silence after that. The kind that felt like glass breaking. Then footsteps. Car doors. The sound of my parents driving away while I lay there in the dark, pretending I hadn't heard any of it. Those arguments planted seeds that would take years to grow into something none of us could ignore. But back then, I just pulled the blanket over my head and told myself families were supposed to be complicated. I didn't know yet that complicated was just another word for broken. 2 years before that dinner, my grandmother died. Margaret Wesley. She passed in her sleep on a Tuesday night in October. The kind of death people call peaceful because it sounds better than admitting someone you love just stopped existing between one breath and the next. She'd been slowing down for a while. Her hands had twisted with arthritis until she couldn't open jars anymore. Her knees gave her trouble on the porch steps. But she'd still been there, still humming while she cooked, still leaving notes on the fridge, still making that house feel like the center of something warm and unbreakable. And then she wasn't. Ian found her in the morning, called 911 even though he already knew, sat on the edge of their bed with her hand in his until the paramedics arrived and gently told him he needed to let go. I drove to his house as soon as I heard. When I got there, he was sitting on the front porch in the same spot where we'd spent 1,000 Sunday afternoons, staring at the woods like they might give him an answer to a question he hadn't figured out how to ask yet. He didn't cry. didn't make a speech. Just looked at me with eyes that had gone somewhere else and said, 46 years. You'd think that'd be enough time to prepare for this. It wasn't. The funeral was small, the way Eloise would have wanted. Friends from church, a few neighbors, the guys Ian used to work with at Davidson's Auto. All of them gray-haired now. All of them looking at Ian like they were seeing their own future. Christopher and Adeline came. Of course. They stood in the front row in expensive black clothes, accepting condolences with somber faces and appropriate words. But when it was over, when people were heading back to Ian's house with casseroles and sympathy, my parents got in their car and left. Your father has a client meeting he can't reschedule, Adeline told me, adjusting her sunglasses. And I have a presentation to finish. You'll stay with Ian, won't you? Make sure he's not alone? I stayed, and kept staying, week after week, because it became clear that nobody else was going to. Ian didn't fall apart in obvious ways. He still got up every morning, still made his coffee in that chipped navy blue mug Eloise had given him on their 20th anniversary, still kept the house running. But life had drained out of it. He'd sit in Eloise's armchair and smooth the fabric like he was trying to press her memory back into the fibers. He'd open the cabinet and stare at the spare mug that would never be used again. He'd cook dinner for two out of habit and then stand there looking at the extra plate like he'd forgotten something important. My parents called sometimes. Quick check-ins that lasted 3 minutes and solved nothing. "How's Dad doing?" Christopher would ask. "He's grieving," I'd say. "Well, that's natural. Let us know if he needs anything," but they never asked what he actually needed, and they never stayed long enough to find out. 6 months after Eloise died, they showed up at Ian's house on a Saturday evening with a bottle of wine. I was there, heating up leftover soup in the kitchen, when I heard Christopher's voice take on that carefully casual tone he used when he was about to pitch something. "Dad, Adeline and I have been talking. We're worried about you being out here by yourself." Ian looked up from the table where he'd been sorting through old photographs. "I'm fine. You had that fall last month," Adeline added, her voice syrup smooth. "On the back steps. You could have really hurt yourself." "I slipped on ice," Ian said. "Landed on my backside. Happens to everyone." "But what if it had been worse?" Christopher leaned forward. "What if you'd hit your head? What if no one had been here to help?" "Then I'd have gotten up and dealt with it," Ian said. "Same as I always have." Adeline reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "We just want you safe. We have plenty of room. You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining this big house anymore. About the bills. About being alone. I'm not a problem that needs solving," Ian said quietly, pulling his hand back. They didn't push. Not that night. Ian held out for another 1.5 years. 18 months of my parents circling back with concerns and suggestions. 18 months of him insisting he was fine in the house he'd built. 18 months of me driving out to Maple Ridge Road every weekend to make sure he actually was. And he was fine. Slower, maybe. Quieter. Definitely. But he still knew every trick for coaxing life out of a stubborn engine. Still remembered the names of every kid who'd ever lived on his street. Still sat on that porch like a man who belonged exactly where he was. But I saw the things he didn't talk about. The way he'd stand in the kitchen doorway sometimes, staring at the empty space where Eloise used to hum over the stove. The bills were piling up on the counter because he kept forgetting which ones he'd already paid. The morning I found him in the garage, looking at his toolbox like he'd forgotten what half the tools were for. One gray afternoon in March, I found him sitting on the porch steps with his coat zipped up and his hands shoved in his pockets. "You want me closer, don't you?" he asked without looking at me. I sat down next to him. "I want you alive, and not alone." He was quiet for a long time, watching the wind move through the bare trees. "There's more to being alive than just breathing, kiddo." Then, softer. "But I'm not blind. I know I'm slowing down. I just don't want to be managed like some project your mother takes on." "You won't be," I said, believing it. 2 weeks later, he agreed to move. He packed like a man who knew he might not be coming back. 1 box of photographs, edges worn soft from years of handling. Eloise's recipe cards in her careful handwriting, his Bible with the cracked spine and notes in the margins, a toolbox with the essentials, and that chipped navy blue mug that had survived 4 decades of use and still held coffee better than anything else. The morning we loaded the last box into my car, he stood on the porch and looked at his house like he was memorizing it. Then he locked the front door, walked down those steps one last time, and pressed the key into my hand. "You keep this for me," he said. "This place isn't done with us yet. I promised we'd come back." If you're enjoying this story and want to see how Aiden protects his grandfather and other stories like this, smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what he discovers next. Quick question for the comments. Would you have moved your grandparent into your parents' house or kept them independent? Let me know below. Now, let's get back to the story. The first few weeks at the Wesley family home almost made me think I'd been wrong to worry. Christopher had a leather recliner delivered to the den, positioned perfectly for watching the television Ian never turned on. Adeline set up a medication organizer and taped a color-coded chart to the refrigerator, checking off each pill like she was managing a critical project. Every morning, they sat with him at breakfast, asking about his sleep, his comfort, whether he needed anything. To anyone watching, it looked like the perfect picture of 3 generations under one roof. But I started noticing details that didn't fit the picture. Ian's medication organizer was always filled correctly, set out on the counter where anyone could see it. But his coffee was different. Every single morning, Adeline prepared it herself. She'd stand at the counter with her back to the room, stirring something into the dark liquid with a focus that seemed excessive for just adding cream and sugar. If I got up to help, she'd wave me off with a bright smile. "I've got it." You know how particular he is about his coffee. And after those breakfasts, Ian would start to drift. At first, it was small things. He'd forget where he'd left his reading glasses. He'd tell me a story about fixing a car at Davidson's, and then tell it again an hour later like it was new. He'd walk into a room and stand there, confused about why he'd gone there in the first place. "It's just age catching up," Christopher said when I mentioned it. "He's 68. This is normal." Adeline nodded, her face arranged in professional sympathy. Cognitive decline accelerates after major life changes. The move, losing Eloise, leaving his routine, it all adds up. But the fog only seemed to roll in after breakfast. After the coffee Adeline made. After Ian drank from that chipped navy blue mug and set it down with slightly trembling hands. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself my parents wouldn't do something like that. I told myself, right up until the morning, I arrived early and found Ian sharp and clear before breakfast and watched him fade within 30 minutes of drinking his coffee. That's when I stopped telling myself anything and started paying attention to what I didn't want to see. I started keeping notes 3 weeks after Ian moved in. Not because I'm naturally suspicious, but because something about the pattern didn't make sense. My grandfather had been slowing down. Sure, grief and age do that to people. But what I was watching happen in my parents' house wasn't a gradual decline. It was something sharper, more specific, and it followed a schedule. I kept a small notebook in my jacket pocket and wrote down what I saw. April 3rd, 8:45 a.m.f. Ian asking me detailed questions about the database architecture I'd been working on, following every technical detail, suggesting solutions I hadn't considered. April 3rd, 9:30 a.m. Ian, staring at the television remote like he'd never seen one before, unable to remember which button turned it on. April 7th, 8:15 a.m. Ian, telling me a story about rebuilding a transmission on a 1967 Mustang, remembering the owner's name, the color of the car, the exact problem with the flywheel. April 7th, 9 a.m. Ian, asking me 3 times in 20 minutes whether I'd heard from my friend Derek, who I'd told him moved to Seattle 2 years ago. The gap between those 2 versions of my grandfather was always the same. Breakfast. Specifically, the coffee Adeline prepared with that intense focus that seemed out of proportion for such a simple task. I started showing up earlier. On a Thursday morning in mid-April, I arrived at 7:30, a full hour before my parents usually started their morning routine. Ian was already awake, sitting in the den with a book open on his lap, a technical manual about fuel injection systems. "Morning, kiddo," he said, looking up with clear eyes. "You're here early." We talked for 45 minutes. He was sharp, present, completely himself. He asked about my work, remembered details from conversations we'd had weeks ago, made jokes that actually landed. When he got up to refill his water glass, his hands were steady. Then Adeline appeared in the doorway in her silk bathrobe, surprise flickering across her face before smoothing into a smile. "Aiden, I didn't know you were coming by this morning." She moved toward the kitchen. "Let me get your grandfather his coffee. He gets irritable without his routine." Ian glanced at me with a small smile. "She's not wrong. 40 years of morning coffee will do that to you." Adeline returned 5 minutes later with a chipped navy blue mug, steam curling off the surface. She set it in front of Ian with a gentle pat on his shoulder. "There you go. Just how you like it." I watched him drink it. I watched Adeline watch him drink it. I watched the way her shoulders relaxed once the mug was empty. 30 minutes later, Ian couldn't remember what book he'd been reading. That's when I stopped dismissing my suspicions as paranoia and started treating them like evidence. Over the next week, I documented everything. I took photos of the medication chart, every pill accounted for. Nothing unusual. I arrived at different times, watching the pattern repeat. Sharp before breakfast, foggy after. I paid attention to who touched what, when, and how. Adeline never let anyone else prepare Ian's coffee. Not Christopher, not me, not even Ian himself. If he got up to make his own, she'd intercept him with concerns about the stove, the hot water, his shaking hands. "Let me help. I don't want you getting burned." And it was always that specific mug, the chipped navy blue one he'd brought from his house. If he reached for a different cup, she'd steer him back. "You prefer this one, remember? It keeps the coffee warmer." On April 22nd, I wrote in my notebook, "He's not getting old, he's being drugged." The thought sat there on the page, stark and impossible. These were my parents. Christopher, who'd never broken a law in his life. Adeline, who'd built a career on helping people optimize their performance. They were calculated and cold, but they weren't criminals, except the evidence kept pointing to the same conclusion. I needed proof. Not suspicions, not patterns, not gut feelings. I needed something concrete that would stand up against the explanations they'd give, the rationalizations they'd construct, the professional opinions they'd weaponize. I needed that coffee tested. The problem was getting a sample without anyone noticing. Adeline watched that mug like it contained state secrets. She prepared it in the kitchen with her back to the room. She hovered near Ian while he drank it. She washed it immediately after he finished, hand-washing it separately from the other dishes, even though everything else went in the dishwasher. But she had patterns too. And patterns had gaps. I just had to find one wide enough to fit through. The opportunity came on a Monday morning when Adeline got a phone call that pulled her out of the kitchen mid-routine. I'd positioned myself carefully. Arrived at 7:45, early enough to see the coffee preparation, but not so early it looked suspicious. I'd brought my laptop, told my parents I had a client meeting at 9 and needed their better internet connection. Christopher had already left for his office. It was just Adeline, Ian, and me. Adeline was at the counter, her back to us, stirring Ian's coffee with that focused attention I'd learned to recognize. The chipped navy blue mug sat in front of her, steam rising. Then her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and her expression shifted, irritation mixed with obligation. "I need to take this," she said, picking up the phone. "It's the Morrison account. They've been trying to reach me for 2 days." She walked toward her home office, already talking in that smooth professional voice she used with high-value clients. "Yes, I got your email. Let me pull up the presentation file." The coffee sat on the counter, unguarded. I had maybe 3 minutes, maybe less. I moved fast, grabbed an empty water bottle from my bag, one I'd washed thoroughly the night before, poured roughly a third of Ian's coffee into it, enough for testing, topped the mug back up from the pot Adeline had brewed, trying to match the color. Sealed the water bottle and shoved it deep into my laptop bag. My hands were shaking. My pulse hammered in my ears so loud I was sure someone would hear it. Ian watched me from the table, confusion crossing his face. "What are you doing?" "Nothing," I said too quickly. "Just getting some coffee for myself." I sat down next to him with my own mug, the one I'd actually poured for myself, and pretended to check emails on my phone while listening for Adeline's footsteps. She came back 4 minutes later, still on the phone but wrapping up the conversation. She glanced at the coffee mug in front of Ian, and for a horrible second I thought she'd noticed the slightly different color, the level being a fraction lower than she'd left it. But she just smiled, ended the call, and carried the mug over to Ian. "Sorry about that. Work never stops, does it?" Ian took the mug, started to lift it to his lips. I forced myself to look away, to act normal, to not stare like I was waiting for something terrible to happen. He drank it, same as every morning. And 30 minutes later, the fog rolled in right on schedule. I left at 8:45 with the water bottle hidden in my bag, telling my parents I'd see them later in the week. In my car, I sat in their driveway for a full minute, staring at that bottle wedged between my laptop and a stack of papers. Part of me wanted to dump it out, pretend I'd never taken it, go back to believing my parents were just overprotective instead of something darker. But I couldn't unsee the pattern. Couldn't unhear the arguments about Ian's property value. Couldn't forget the way Adeline guarded that coffee like it was the most important task in her entire day. I drove to a medical testing lab 30 minutes outside of town, far enough that no one in my parents' social circle would accidentally spot my name on a client list. The technician at the front desk took the sample without asking questions I couldn't answer. "We're looking for any substances that shouldn't be in coffee," I said. "Sedatives, sleep aids, anything that might affect cognitive function." She labeled the bottle with a reference number. "Results in 3 business days. We'll call when they're ready." 3 days felt like a lifetime. I went to work, wrote code that probably had more bugs than usual because I couldn't focus. Slept poorly. Checked my phone every 20 minutes like the lab might somehow finish early. I visited Ian twice during those 3 days. I watched the same pattern play out. Sharp before breakfast, diminished after. I watched Adeline prepare that coffee with the same careful attention. I watched my father read the newspaper and not notice anything wrong because he'd already decided there was nothing wrong to notice. On Thursday afternoon, my phone rang. "Mr. Wesley? This is Memorial Lab Services. Your results are ready." I pulled over into a gas station parking lot. Opened the PDF they sent to my email. Sample analysis results. Substance detected. Zolpidem. 10 milligrams concentration. Common brand names. Ambien. Classification. Sedative hypnotic. Effects. Drowsiness. Short-term memory impairment. Confusion. Decreased cognitive function. I sat there in my car, staring at those words until they blurred. They were drugging him. Every single morning. Deliberately. Systematically. Knowing they were drugging Ian was one thing. Understanding why was another. I could have confronted them with the lab results. Could have walked into that house, slammed the paper down on their perfect dining table, and demanded answers. But I'd grown up watching my mother dismantle people's arguments for a living. She'd have an explanation ready, something about doctor's orders, about helping Ian sleep better, about concern for his anxiety after losing Eloise. She'd twist it into care instead of crime, and without proof of motive, I'd just be the ungrateful son who didn't understand the complexities of elder care. I needed to know what they were actually trying to accomplish. So I went shopping for cameras, not the obvious kind. Small ones, the type marketed for home security, designed to blend into everyday objects. A clock for the kitchen, a phone charger for their bedroom, a smoke detector for the den where they had most of their private conversations after Ian went to sleep. I installed them on a Wednesday afternoon when everyone was out. Christopher at a client meeting, Adeline at a corporate training session downtown, Ian at a doctor's appointment. I'd volunteered to take him to an appointment where, interestingly, the doctor found nothing wrong with his cognitive function that couldn't be explained by normal aging and grief. The cameras linked to an app on my phone. Live feed. Motion-activated recording. Cloud storage backup. I felt like a criminal setting them up. Felt worse knowing I was spying on my own parents. But then I'd remember Ian's clear eyes going foggy. Remember that lab report. Remember the way Adeline watched him drink that coffee like she was waiting for results. The first useful footage came that same night. I was in my apartment, eating takeout that had gone cold while I watched my phone screen, when Christopher and Adeline appeared in the den. They thought they were alone. Ian had gone to bed an hour earlier, shuffling upstairs with the slow uncertainty that came after a full day of being medicated. Christopher poured himself scotch from the bar cart. Adeline kicked off her heels and sank into the couch with her tablet. "How much longer do we keep this up?" Christopher asked. Adeline didn't look up from her screen. "Doctor Patterson said consistent symptoms over 3 months make the strongest case for diminished capacity. We're at 7 weeks. And the paperwork? I've already drafted the power of attorney documents. Once we have a medical evaluation stating he can't manage his own affairs, we file for guardianship. It's a formality at that point." Christopher swirled his scotch, staring into it like it might hold answers. "He's going to fight it. He won't be able to," Adeline said, finally looking up. "That's the point. By the time we file, he'll have documented memory loss, confusion, inability to manage daily tasks. His own doctor's notes will support our case." My stomach turned over. "What about Aiden?" Christopher asked. "What about him? He's been watching his grandfather decline for weeks. He'll probably be relieved that someone's finally taking action," Adeline said. The confidence in her voice made me want to throw my phone across the room. The second conversation happened 2 nights later. Adeline was at her laptop at the kitchen table, while Christopher stood behind her, looking over her shoulder. "Meadowbrook costs too much," he said. "We're not paying $4,000 a month. Shady Pines is $2,000, Adeline replied, clicking through what looked like a website. "Medicaid eligible. Once we sell his property, we'll have enough to cover placement costs and still walk away with the rest." "How much is the property actually worth now?" Adeline pulled up another window, a real estate assessment site. "The house and land together? Current market value is around $870,000. He bought it for $60,000 in 1979. Christopher let out a low whistle, and he just sits on it. "Not for much longer." Adeline's voice was matter-of-fact, like they were discussing stock portfolios instead of dismantling someone's life. "Once we have guardianship, we can liquidate assets we deem necessary for his care. The house is too much for him to manage anyway. This way everyone benefits." "Everyone except him," Christopher said, but he didn't sound particularly bothered by it. The third conversation, the one that made everything crystal clear, came on Sunday night. They were in their bedroom. Adeline was organizing pill bottles on her dresser, while Christopher changed out of his church clothes. They'd spent the afternoon looking like the perfect devoted family. "You're sure the Ambien won't show up in his regular blood work?" Christopher asked. "It metabolizes quickly, and his doctor isn't looking for it. Why would he? We're the concerned children worried about our declining father. What if Aiden gets suspicious? He already thinks aging is the problem. Besides, even if he suspected something, what's he going to do? Test his grandfather's coffee?" She laughed. Actually laughed. "We're helping Ian, making sure he's safe, cared for, not alone in that falling apart house. That's the story. That's what everyone sees." Christopher sat on the edge of the bed. "I just want this done. The business loans are due in 4 months. And if we can't, we'll have the money." Adeline cut him off. "Ian's property alone covers everything we owe, plus enough to stabilize cash flow. We just need him declared incompetent first." I stopped the recording and just sat there in my apartment with my hands shaking and something cold spreading through my chest. They weren't just drugging him. They were systematically destroying his competence, manufacturing evidence of decline, and positioning themselves to take everything he'd spent a lifetime building. The house he'd built with his own hands, the property he and Eloise had loved, his entire legacy, and they were doing it because they'd made bad financial decisions and saw him as the solution. I couldn't do this alone. I couldn't go to the police with recordings that might not even be admissible. I couldn't confront my parents without them destroying evidence and spinning the narrative. I needed Ian, not the foggy, diminished version my parents were creating. The real Ian. The man who taught me to pay attention to what people weren't saying. The man who could outthink anyone when the stakes were high enough. I needed to tell him the truth and hope it didn't break him. I caught Ian on a Tuesday morning at 7 o'clock, before anyone else was awake. I'd let myself in with the spare key my parents had given me, moved quietly through the dark house, and found him already up in the den, sitting in that leather recliner with a book in his lap. His eyes were clear, sharp. This was the real version of my grandfather, the one that existed before breakfast. Aiden. He looked surprised but not displeased. "You're here early. I need to show you something," I said, "before Mom makes your coffee." Something in my voice made him close the book and sit forward. "What's going on?" I sat down across from him and pulled out my phone. "I'm going to show you some things that are going to be hard to hear, but I need you to stay quiet until I'm done. Can you do that?" He studied my face for a long moment, and I saw the mechanic in him, the man who'd spent decades diagnosing problems other people couldn't see. "Show me." I started with the lab report and watched his expression go from confusion to disbelief to something harder and colder than I'd ever seen on his face. Then I played the recordings. All 3 conversations. Every word my parents had said when they thought no one was listening. When I finished, the room was silent except for the sound of the heating system kicking on. Ian sat back in the recliner. His hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white. But his face was calm. Dangerously calm. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Nearly 8 weeks. Since about 2 weeks after you moved in, and you've been watching this happen." "I've been gathering proof," I said. "Because if I'd confronted them without it, they'd have explained it away. Made me look paranoid. Made you look incapable of understanding." He nodded slowly. I looked at the phone in my hands like it contained something both terrible and valuable. $870,000. That's what the property assessment said. "Your grandmother and I paid $60,000 for that land. It took us 5 years to save the down payment." His voice was steady, but I could hear the fury underneath it. "I built that house with my own hands. Every room, every addition. Eloise planted the garden. We raised your father there, and they want to sell it to pay off business loans I didn't even know existed. They're planning to put you in a facility called Shady Pines," I said. $2,000 a month, Medicaid eligible, while they pocket the rest." He looked at me. "You said 7 weeks. How much longer were they planning to do this?" "At least 5 more. They need 3 months of documented decline to make the guardianship case bulletproof." Ian stood up and walked to the window. The sun was starting to come up, throwing pale light across the perfectly maintained lawn. "They're going to bring me that coffee in about 45 minutes. I know. And if I drink it, I'll spend the rest of the day forgetting pieces of myself." "Yes." He turned around. "What if I don't drink it?" I'd been waiting for this question. I'd been thinking about it for 3 days straight. Then we let them think it's working while we figure out what to do next. "You mean I pretend? I mean you become the thing they're trying to create, but you stay sharp underneath it. Make them think they're winning." A smile ghosted across his face, the kind of smile that had nothing to do with humor. "They expect a victim. Let's give them one." Over the next 2 hours, we built the plan. Ian would dump the coffee when no one was looking, down the sink, into a plant, anywhere it wouldn't end up inside him. But he'd act exactly like he'd been acting. Confused, forgetful, diminished. He'd give them the evidence they wanted while staying clear-headed enough to help me gather more. "They're planning a family gathering," I said. 3 weeks from now. They want to announce in front of everyone that they're taking over your care." "Then that's where we do it," Ian said. "In front of everyone. Let them invite all the witnesses they want." "We'll need more than recordings," I said. "We need documentation. Your will, your property records, proof that you're mentally competent." "I'll handle that," Ian interrupted. "I still know a lawyer who doesn't ask stupid questions. We'll get everything in order. They're going to see this as betrayal. They drugged me, Ian said flatly. For money. That's not family. That's theft. With a blood relation. The sound of footsteps upstairs made us both freeze. Adeline was awake. Ian moved fast for a man who was supposed to be declining. He grabbed a magazine from the side table, opened it to a random page, and settled back into the recliner with his eyes slightly unfocused. By the time Adeline appeared in the doorway, he looked exactly like what she expected to see. An old man, staring blankly at a page he wasn't really reading. "Good morning," she said brightly. "Aiden, I didn't know you were here. Just stopped by before work," I said. She smiled and headed toward the kitchen. "Let me get your grandfather his coffee." Ian caught my eye for just a second. Then he went back to pretending to be the person they were trying to turn him into. 3 weeks passed like that. Ian played the diminished grandfather while staying sharp underneath. Me, gathering final pieces of evidence, compiling the video, preparing for the moment everything would come out into the open. My parents planned their dinner party exactly as we'd expected. They sent invitations to relatives and neighbors, ordered catering, polished their home until it gleamed. They were building their stage, creating the perfect audience for what they thought would be their triumphant announcement about taking over Ian's care. They had no idea they were building ours. The night arrived. Guests filled the dining room with warmth and laughter, completely unaware of what was really happening in this house. Christopher and Adeline moved through the crowd, accepting praise for their selflessness. Ian sat at the table looking foggy and distant, playing his part perfectly, and I sat at the far end with my phone in my pocket, waiting for the right moment. That moment came when Mrs. Chen raised her glass and called for a toast. I stood up. Every head turned toward me. "Before the toast," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I put together a video, a tribute to my parents and everything they've done for Grandpa Ian since he moved in." I pulled out my phone. "I think everyone should see exactly what's been happening in this house." Christopher's smile. "Aiden, that's thoughtful. But maybe it'll just take a few minutes." I pressed play. The TV screen flared to life, and the dining room went silent. The first thing that appeared was a document. Lab results, blown up large enough for everyone in the room to read. Confused murmurs rippled through the guests. Aunt Rachel leaned toward Mrs. Chen, whispering something I couldn't hear. Uncle Jim's face creased with confusion. Then the audio started. My mother's voice, crystal clear, coming through the speakers. Dr. Patterson said consistent symptoms over 3 months make the strongest case for diminished capacity. We're at 7 weeks. My father's voice followed. "And the paperwork?" "I've already drafted the power of attorney documents." The room wasn't just quiet anymore. It was frozen. The video continued. Clip after clip of conversations my parents had thought were private. Talk of guardianship, discussion of nursing homes. The property value displayed on screen, $870,000. My mother's voice explaining how the Ambien wouldn't show up in blood work. My father asking what they'd do if I got suspicious. I watched Christopher's face drain of color. Watched Adeline's carefully constructed composure crack down the middle. "This is," Christopher started, but his voice died when the next clip played. My mother, laughing. Even if he suspected something, what's he going to do? Test his grandfather's coffee? Mrs. Chen stood up from the table, her chair scraping loud against the hardwood. 2 other guests followed. The room was fracturing, people backing away from my parents like they'd just discovered something toxic at the center of the dinner party. "That's taken out of context," Adeline said, finding her voice, shifting into damage control mode. "This is a misunderstanding. We've been trying to help." "Help?" The voice came from the other end of the table. Everyone turned. Ian was standing. Not the diminished, foggy version they'd all seen shuffling through the house. He stood straight, shoulders back, eyes sharp and clear and absolutely furious. "You've been helping," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "By drugging my coffee every morning for over 2 months. By manufacturing symptoms to make me look incompetent. By planning to lock me in a facility while you sold everything I built to pay for your business mistakes." Adeline's mouth opened, but nothing came out. I've been dumping that coffee for 3 weeks, Ian continued. Every single morning, I watched you poison me, and I smiled and pretended it was working. Because I needed to know how far you'd go. And now everyone here knows too. He pulled a folder from beside his chair, documents I'd helped him prepare with his lawyer. My will has been updated. My property is protected under a trust. And I've already filed legal documentation proving my mental competence, witnessed and notarized. He looked at Christopher and Adeline with something that might have been pity if it weren't so cold. You don't get to take what I built. You don't get to erase me. Uncle Jim pulled out his phone. I'm calling the police. Don't bother, Ian said. They're already aware. Elder abuse charges were filed yesterday. The guests were leaving now, gathering coats and purses, throwing horrified glances at my parents as they hurried toward the door. Nobody wanted to be associated with what they'd just witnessed. Christopher sank into a chair, his face in his hands. Adeline stood rigid, her perfect facade shattered, trying to find an argument that would make this okay and coming up empty. Ian walked over to where I was standing, put his hand on my shoulder. Real family, he said, loud enough for the few remaining guests to hear. Doesn't control. Doesn't manipulate. Doesn't see the people they love as problems to solve or assets to liquidate. He looked at Christopher, his own son, with disappointment that cut deeper than anger ever could. Family protects. Family honors. Family shows up not because there's something to gain, but because love doesn't come with conditions. The police arrived 20 minutes later. By then, the house was nearly empty. Just me, Ian, 2 stunned neighbors who'd stayed to give statements, and my parents sitting in separate rooms, their perfect world collapsed around them. Ian and I left together, drove back to Maple Ridge Road, to the house with the crooked porch, and the mismatched furniture, and the years of memories built into every wall. He made coffee in that chipped navy blue mug. Real coffee this time, with nothing added but cream. We sat on the front porch as the sun set, not talking much, just existing in a space where trust still meant something. Home, Ian said finally, looking at the woods he'd refused to clear, isn't about walls. It's about who you trust with the key. I still had his key in my pocket. Had never given it back, and I never would. If this story hit different for you, kindly subscribe for more stories where the overlooked, underestimated, and betrayed get the last word. Hit that like button if you're satisfied with how this played out. And here's my question for you. Do you think Christopher and Adeline deserve a second chance, or did they burn that bridge for good? Drop your honest opinion in the comments. And thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story where someone earns their revenge.